So it seems that the majority of Warhammer 40k collectors are expecting some massive range cuts to the Custodes and the Imperial Knights, and when I asked you guys your expectations, most people think that their big and expansive Forge World ranges are eventually going to go to Legends. Let's talk about the possibility, and why people are concerned about these big, fairly popular and expensive models. Hello and welcome back to Warsbets Tactics, where today I wanted to talk about the possible threats to the Knights and the Heresy Forge World ranges in the context of just how many fancy resin kits Games Workshop has sent the way of Warhammer Legends in recent times. 9th edition Warhammer 40k certainly had a few phased out models, plenty of resin and metal kits going out of production, and Games Workshop starting with less rule support for things that didn't have specific models or war gear options. Maybe something that's been a bit of a turning point in 40k, rather than endlessly expanding more and more kits. Games Workshop seem to be narrowing down their ranges a bit more, and cutting out a lot of stuff they deem peripheral. 10th edition really took that to the next level with certain things like big firstborn phase-outs, and lots of characters being removed if they didn't have an updated plastic kit. The single biggest loss of models though has perhaps been for all of the Heresy and Forge World models that have gradually gone to Legends and gone out of production for plenty of them over the first couple of years of 10th. It basically feels like Games Workshop have made an overall strategic decision to make Warhammer 40k a plastic-only game, and that means either updating or removing all their fine cast resin, and particularly their Forge World resin, lots of which many factions have big back catalogues for, and they've basically gone off sale and gotten the final Legends datasheets, but not quite as full support as they had previously. Most of the things that remain on sale for 40k with full rule support are things like the massive Titans. Games Workshop may be going for the idea of sort of sidelining them by giving them some slightly impractically high points costs, and these ones are big core models that most people wouldn't want removed from the setting, but they'd be unlikely to make big plastic kits for them. I think as resin is just a bit more practical for some of the very large pieces that might struggle to fit on sprues and things. As the codexes have come out, Forge World units have been taken down for each faction in turn, and the only exceptions have been for the Knight armies and the Adeptus Custodes, both of which Games Workshop said would be treated differently in 10th edition, the Custodes with their Forge World range being the only things they have to fill a whole bunch of battlefield roles that you expect of lots of armies in Warhammer 40k, and the Knights having their alternative chassis like the big Cerastus ones and the Questors Megara and Styrex. In terms of miniatures and datasheets, Forge World again makes up around about half of their roster. Their entire status in Warhammer 40k and Heresy has been brought up again, due to Games Workshop teasing new plastic Custodes for the Horus Heresy. This was really predictable given what they've been doing for the rest of the Heresy era armies. All of the most major factions for the Horus Heresy had had plastic kits released for them, a good chunk of their previous Forge World resin updated in plastic, the Custodes and their Sisters of Silence allies, with the last big faction that hadn't happened to yet, but it seems that it could be just around the corner with Games Workshop showing off this Guardian Spear in a teaser trailer, saying that it was made out of plastic, and also conspicuously the rulebook for Adeptus Custodes and the Talons of the Emperor is being delayed versus the rest of them in the new edition of the Horus Heresy, so it sounds like that's being held back until they've released a bunch of new kits and maybe made some updates to the rules for what you can field. It probably means the current Forge World Adeptus Custodes kits might well see plastic, or at least a whole chunk of them will, things like the Anti-Grav Caladius Grav Tank, maybe things like the Telemon or their Patterns of Contemptor Dreadnoughts. They've got plenty of models beyond that. On top of that, could be an option to revisit some of the Sisters of Silence as well. They've had some units for quite a while in the Heresy that have never really had model representation, such as their subjugated cadres that can ride jet bikes. Seems like they'd have at least fairly good odds of getting a plastic kit if there was a big range update for them, never mind all of the war gear options that some of the more normal Sisters of Silence units can field. The Knight armies for their own part seem to be on the slow burn for the Horus Heresy release cycle. So far they've redone 3 of the Cerastus Knights in plastic, the Lancer Acheron and Castigator. I guess they're probably going to be sort of drip-fed rolled out. Feels likely they'll do the Atropos at some point, given that that's the only Cerastus one they haven't done yet, and the Questor Megara and Styrex both seem to have been rumoured, but so far we've got no model reveal for them. The biggest question for people collecting those factions is whether or not Games Workshop will let them stay for Warhammer 40k or not, or at least with mainline rule support rather than being mothballed in Legends. The Forge World removals in their own right maybe are enough to cause concern. I feel like the better example is certainly the Legends of the Horus Heresy thing that they did for Space Marines at the start of 10th edition. That just feels like a very direct analogue, and it's probably the main reason why people are quite so concerned that something similar might happen to these, perhaps particularly that the order that happened in was that Games Workshop sold people the models and then put them to Legends, rather than the other way around. There's definitely no guarantee that it would happen, and I certainly hope that it doesn't. I've got a Knight Lancer that I'd rather that not happen to put it lightly. It could be really quite a big deal to Knights and Custodes players given their Forge World and Plastic Heresy ranges are huge chunks of their army. And while obviously Legends support is far better than no support, and you can still use them in casual games and everything, I certainly feel like models having their rules sent there is pretty much a flat downgrade. You're just going to get massively less thought put into them, even less so than now. There'll likely not be all that much effort to make sure that they work well in their armies. Maybe be kind of ineffective on the tabletop, though some quirk of their rules makes one of their datasheets broken strong for some reason in a new codex. Again, that's not really likely to get fixed. I say overall it's really not the end of the world for people playing casual games with them, but still worse rule support than Games Workshop actually looking after them in their own codex. As mentioned at the start of the video, I asked you your thoughts as to whether or not you thought that these guys would go to Legends at some stage. Collecting both of those armies does make me a little bit apprehensive about that, though I was kind of surprised at just how many people thought that it was a good chance they would go to Legends. 3/4 of people suspected that they might. I think it's expecting a chunk too, but maybe not a majority, though I suppose models being removed from codexes and going to Legends really has been a bit of a depressing theme of 10th edition. Clearly the closest analogue for these guys though is the Legends of the Heresy thing that happened towards the start of 10th. I feel like for just literally one update, this might have been one of the single biggest phase outs of models in Warhammer 40k basically ever. A massive amount of Space Marine kits got sent to Legends, things like the Contemptor Dreadnoughts, the Kratos tanks, Leviathan Dreadnoughts, and all manner of other Forge World things that built up over the years, either went to Legends of the Horus Heresy or to a Space Marine Legends document, and their models went off sale if they were more contemporary things. Really quite a vast amount of kits, with Contemptors and Leviathans being at least fairly popular in the previous edition. And it was at least fairly sad times for Chaos Space Marines as well, with things like their Decimators, Greater Blast Scorpions, and other Demon Engine style units again going to Legends of the Horus Heresy, which was kind of peculiar in its own right, given that they hadn't really been overly associated with that setting before, and generally tended to be more seen as 40k models rather than anything to do with the Heresy. They said for future Heresy era releases they'd only make datasheets in 40k for Heresy era units that will be considered commonplace in the 41st millennium. As best I can tell, I think that equates to none so far, unless I'm missing any obvious examples there. This was definitely enormously painful for many collectors that might have gone heavy on those sort of kits, and perhaps particularly so as quite a lot of people have been waiting to get their hands on Contemptor Dreadnoughts and Leviathan Dreadnoughts to play in Warhammer 40k. Lots of people like the look of those units, and they have been really quite effective on the tabletop over the past couple of editions, things like the Volkite Contemptors or the Storm Cannon Leviathans. So there's at least a reasonable chance a lot of Space Marine collectors have picked up one or more of those, only to have them probably somewhat sidelined. Perhaps one of the best examples of this one was the Kratos tank with its 40k rules. This was a new pattern of tank for the Horus Heresy, maybe somewhere between a Sakaran tank and a Fellblade. A great big Space Marine heavy tank that was broadly at least a fairly well received model, I think. They released it in June 2022, and they even had an entire article promoting the rules for it for Warhammer 40k. That came out around about the launch week, and probably added to the popularity of people picking it up, as you're not just appealing to the people who play Horus Heresy, but also 40k players as well, and a lot more people play 40k than Heresy. Looking back at the article now, it says it would be a shame if such a marvel were lost to the mist of time, which I'm sure plenty would agree with, but it didn't really stop them putting it into Warhammer Legends in summer 2023, so around the release of 10th edition, so around a year worth of the Kratos tank having full mainline rule support for 40k before going Legends. That one certainly strikes me as very bad faith marketing in hindsight, and particularly for expensive plastic tanks like this at £85 or $136. When they did their Legends of the Horus Heresy release, this was when they announced that the Knights, Titans and Custodes would be exceptions to the Legend of the Horus Heresy, but didn't necessarily say how long that would be for. Whether that's completely indefinitely into 40k's far future, or just for 10th edition, and it feels like with examples of the Kratos tank, what Games Workshop say 1 year might not necessarily carry weight several years later. In any case, in that article revolving around the Knights and Titans, they said that there's always exceptions. The war machines of the Knight household and Titan legions have endured for 10,000 years, and those models will continue to receive supported rules for Warhammer 40,000 in their Imperial Armor Index, so they'll be usable in the competitive settings, and basically the Adeptus Custodes are another exception, stating that their war gear and arms haven't changed in the 10,000 years or so, so maybe trying to lean a bit on the lore as for those changes, as opposed to model practicalities, but I sort of don't buy that all of this is solely lore decisions, otherwise things like the Chaos Demon engines like the Decimator and Blood Slaughterer and things. To my understanding, most of that set of models was primarily 40k in the rules and hadn't really got profiles in Heresy. Lore related to them maybe feels like it more got rewritten, and it feels more to me like those two armies just had half of their models in Forge World and Heresy era stuff, to the point where it makes more sense for them to keep them, maybe more so than the other factions that have got far more fleshed out mainline 40k ranges. I do feel like it would have a very different sort of overall vibe if it happened to the Knights and Custodes versus the Space Marines. At least for core Codex Marines, when they had all the Primaris and all the Firstborn active at the same time, they did have an enormously bloated codex before you even delved into all the Forge World datasheets that they could field. It's a bit less so for the Custodians and the Knights, where half or more of their ranges might be in resin or Heresy era plastic models, and particularly for the Custodes, they rely on those to cover a whole bunch of battlefield roles, so you've really been cutting down their options as an army by taking them away. It does mean that the units in those armies are a bit of an oddity within Warhammer 40k though. The Sevastus Knights that Games Workshop have redone in plastic are clearly primarily aimed as part of the Horus Heresy range as opposed to the 40k range at this point. I don't believe there's anything currently on the packaging that indicates that it's for Warhammer 40k as well. It's all the Heresy style stuff. It's maybe a bit disappointing that even though Games Workshop has rescued them from very expensive Forge World resin and made them to be some of 40k's most expensive plastic kits instead, even the nicely redone plastic Knights don't get to go in the Imperial or Chaos Knight Codex. The Sevastus chassis are still all in the Imperial Armour Index, which was perhaps a small disappointment. It would have had quite a nice feel if they decided to incorporate them for 10th edition. I can see why you might not do so for Forge World models, given that they were a bit of a tangential range in the past, but now they've got full-on plastic kits, it really feels like they could embrace them if they wanted to. Heresy things being largely kept out of Warhammer 40k and vice versa seems to be part of Games Workshop's general idea to try and keep both their settings and their factions about as different as possible and requiring different miniatures to play them. This maybe does feel like it's been a bit of a trend from Games Workshop, perhaps particularly over the last 10 years or so. Say some examples being the demons being increasingly divergent in Warhammer 40k versus Sigmar, when they started out being able to play largely the same army in each. The Primaris models in 40k basically meaning they're not so compatible with Heresy compared with what they were in the past. And between different armies there being less overlap, say things like World Eaters, Emperor's Children and Death Guard, or having diverged a fair bit without access to some of the generic Chaos Space Marine kit you might expect them to have. Or even between squads, say for Space Marines. In the past there might have been quite a few different ways that you could field a Space Marine with a bolter or heavy weapons, but now each of the Primaris units basically has their own set miniatures with their own set war gear, and if they're armed with one weapon then they basically work for one unit and that's it, for the most part. I guess for most of these the idea is to try and keep their products as separate as possible, so that if you want to play any unit in any army and any gaming system, you'd have to buy completely new models to do that, perhaps partly playing into the idea of trying to keep their separates feeling distinct and not blurring into each other, and trying to tie units and armies to products. I feel like with these ones specifically, like the Legends of the Horus Heresy, reducing overlap between 40k and Heresy things, I guess you could say that maybe they want you to buy a whole new army to play a different system. I feel like that's probably not the overall motivation, and maybe just playing into the way that they do things more generally. Certainly for things like the Knights and Custodes, if they were joint released for 40k and Heresy, you'd expect more sales, not less, I suspect, as players who like the models from both systems would be keen to pick them up. I've seen some people speculate some departmental competition within the Games Workshop, perhaps trying to keep the Heresy and the 40k sales figures somewhat separate from each other. I guess maybe if the team responsible for one setting develops a kit to try and get some sales for their setting, and then one of the other systems pinches a bunch of sales from them by releasing something that applies to their setting, perhaps that could lead to some conflict. I've got no idea whether that's actually the case though, just something that I've heard people bandy around. And outside of Games Workshop suddenly very clearly showing what goes on behind the scenes, we're not really likely to find out if that's any part of it. For the Knights and the Custodes though, clearly people feel pretty pessimistic on them. I guess expectations being set by 10th edition's relentless cycle of removing Forge World units, and also what they did with the Heresy Legends at the start of 10th. Obviously I certainly hope that it's not the case, and really I'd quite like to see the Plastic Knights get added into the Imperial and Chaos Knight codexes, and the Custodes units just widely expand the army to be usable both in Heresy and 40k. If they did that though, that'd largely be a departure from the norm in any sort of recent times. I feel like they've not really done entire armies that are deliberately designed to appeal to both settings in recent years. It's been quite a long time since Chaos Demons, maybe just more individual models like the Demon Prince and Be'lakor, both of those were usable for Sigmar and 40k. If they could do something like that on a bigger scale for Heresy and 40k, when the Custodes and the rest of the Knights get redone, I think people would really like it. There seems like there's at least a reasonable chance that they won't. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on these ones. What do you think the odds are of the Custodes and the Knights going to Legends when 11th edition comes around? Do you think that they'll continue to have their safe pass compared with the other Forge World stuff? Or as with the Plastic Heresy things, could new Plastic Sculpts be a reason to sideline them for 40k? I'll leave that there for now though. If you'd like to see more Warhammer 40k discussion and things, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel and you'd like to help keep them coming, I'll leave a link to the channel's Patreon page down in the video description below. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.